Just one quick little Montclair film announcement plug. We did reschedule our spring festival that we had to cancel because of COVID, but we now have dates on the calendar for October 16th to 25th. We'll be having the Montclair Film Festival, and it'll be a combination of virtual screenings. So we obviously are not going to put anybody in a position where we want you to do anything unsafe. So it'll be a combination of virtual screenings and drive-in events. So we're working on that now, but just put that on your radar. So I will turn it over to Ken.
Okay. One little tech thing too, if you find your thing is lagging, your video's hanging up and things like that, turn off your video, turn off your camera if you're just listening and things, and it might speed up your connection a little bit because we have a lot of people pumping out the video. Okay, so They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, which the title supposedly was something that Wells said, and then they actually say in the documentary, I don't think he ever said that, but it was kind of a feeling that he had, that he wasn't as well loved at the end of his career and life as perhaps he thought he should have been. So this is an interesting documentary. It comes out, as it said in the notes, 33 years after he died and 48 years after he started shooting The Other Side of the Wind film. So there's a lot of years here. Wells was making the film when he had money. And so he would do films where he would act, and later on he was doing commercials and things like that, or voiceovers. And if he got some money, then he would pump it into doing the film. And when he ran out of money, he stopped and picked it up again. So right there, you know, there's going to be a little bit of an issue in putting together the movie because people age and people disappear, and some people even died that were in the film and left. So he actually started shooting the film in 1970, and he had been living in Europe where he really did feel he was better appreciated. You see a bunch of clips, especially in France, where he was giving talks, and he was kind of convinced to come back, and that Hollywood wanted him to do a comeback film, but they didn't actually have funding for it. So I'm not exactly sure why he would come back, but he shot from 70 to 76, and he was still editing and looking for distribution until his death. He really did think of this film as sort of a satire, a takeoff, a little bit of mocking of Hollywood of the time. He was not a big fan of Hollywood in the 70s, which was called the New Hollywood, was kind of the nickname, which was kind of a takeoff on the French cinema being called the New Wave. And some of the films that came out he thought were ridiculous, stupid, silly films. We'll talk about the one that in particular he was making fun of that came out that first year that he started shooting. And his idea was to take an old filmmaker who had a lot of great films in him, who wants to make one more film, and the film he wants to make like a new Hollywood film like they're looking for these days. So he got John Huston, who was a friend, to play the director, and John shot over the years in all those different places. It also mentions that his girlfriend at the time, she gets co-writing credit for the screenplay, which is kind of crazy because she doesn't have a single line in it. It's all silent. But she plays the actress in the film. And this is all supposed to take place in the film on one day, the last day of Jake's life, before he dies in a car accident, at a party that's being held where they're going to screen what they have of The Other Side of the Wind, which is the film that Jake is making. And we talk about the fact that a lot of the footage that's on in the documentary is stuff that no one had seen before. They uncovered a lot of stuff that they had. I think they had 100 hours of actual footage for The Other Side of the Wind. And he did actually have what they call a work print, where he put together scenes in the order and actually fully edited a few scenes that are exactly the way he wanted them. But a lot of the other things were kind of guesswork. Gary Graver, who was the cinematographer who shows up in the documentary, had died in 2006. So they didn't really have him to refer to, but they had his notes. He kept notes, a date book about things. Another thing that I discovered was he didn't use scene numbers. I mean, they didn't really have a script. They kind of make fun of that in the film where they talk about, there was a script, right? They're not really a script. So when they would shoot a reel, he would mark the reel with something like Jake in car, Peter at bathroom door. So no one knew like which one's, is it number 4? Is that the 5th scene? Is it the 6th? Like it was very hard. Bogdanovich said he remembered some of it. And so he was giving them pointers on how to do it. It all started in 2015. The director, Wes Anderson, and Noah Baumbach were the ones who said that they were going to start a campaign to raise $2 million in order to put the film together. I actually donated to it. It was one of those, what do they call that fundraising site?
Kickstarter.
Kickstarter. It was a Kickstarter. And if you donated $10, you got such and such, and $50, you got something else, and you got a free release and everything. They ended up not using that. The Kickstarter was dissolved and the money went back to people because Netflix stepped in and said they would pony up about $12 million to put together the film, which is what they consider the budget for a typical independent film. So everything had been shot, but there was a lot of editing and things to do with it and everything. So that was their budget for it. And that guaranteed them also distribution through Netflix. So that was a good thing. Let's see what else pre our questions here. I don't know what people's feeling is, and you can talk about what you think of Orson Welles. I really like Orson Welles as a person, as a director, and I like a lot of his films. I know a lot of people think of him as sort of a blowhard, and he did the commercials for wine, and he was on a lot of talk shows and things like that. And even Bogdanovich, who was really close with him and allowed Welles to live at his house for a number of years when he didn't have money. He kind of badmouthed Bogdanovich on television on the Tonight Show, and it really hurt Bogdanovich. And they didn't talk for like a year or two, and then at the end of his life, they kind of patched things up a little bit. But he didn't really like him. And actually, Bogdanovich, of course, was making films at the time, and was one of the hot new Hollywood directors. The Last Picture Show was a film that he was working on, and Welles is the one who told him to shoot it in black and white. And but he didn't particularly like the film. Welles, he was not a big fan of these new Hollywood films. So that was his idea for how to put this whole thing together. So I'm going to follow the questions as much as possible, but we can jump around wherever you want. So this movie, as I said, I think it's a little bit like Jim and Andy and The Man on the Moon, in that if you watch both of them, the order you watch them will kind of change your perception of both of the films. I recommend it you watch the documentary first because it would help explain The Other Side of the Wind, which is, I don't know, kind of a crazy film to begin with. If you didn't watch The Other Side of the Wind, you're okay. You don't have to watch it. But is there anyone who watched both of the films and wants to talk a little bit about those two parts? I'm going to switch my view here. Did anyone watch both films?
I watched part of the film of The Other Side of the Wind. I watched the whole thing of the documentary twice, actually.
Uh-oh.
And then I started watching, but I ran out of time, really. And I found that if you have ADD, it really, really enhances it a lot. I mean, it found it very hard to follow. I was like, holy mackerel, what is
the
this?
Film or the documentary?
The Other Side of the Wind, the film.
The Other Side of the Wind.
Yeah.
But do you think it would help if you had seen the documentary before you watched
Oh,
the
I
film?
did see it. I did see it. I did see the documentary first.
Yeah. But if somebody just walked into a theater and watched The Other Side of the Wind, I think they'd be baffled about what's going on.
I was baffled. I would have been in better shape at the real theater because I would have had to sit still at home. I can't sit. It's true sometimes. You sit in the movie and you pay more attention. You focus better. I don't focus as well at home. So, so something that took me off just really, it just was like, whoa, there's so many people walking around and coming in and out, So it was, I found it a challenge.
Okay. Anyone else who watched both? Nobody went for the extra credit? I said
I
it was
watched
worth it.
both.
You
I
watched
did
both?
too.
Okay. What'd you
You know,
think?
I thought that I loved how he lampooned the whole notion of New Hollywood. How
Okay.
he made the film, you know, it was very entertaining, but it was also very incoherent and peculiarly set. And I think it's interesting to see how his films, when he first started out, or throughout his career actually, were dynamic and different, and it was the studio that was always meddling on it. And then he was showing how the pendulum swung completely to the opposite direction, and now the filmmakers had no control from the studios, and they were just putting stuff up there. Because what happened, this all started with Easy Rider. The studios couldn't figure out how Easy Rider became such a success. So then what they decided was just to bring in all these young filmmakers and let them run amok. And then they all started coming up with stuff like Dennis Hopper's The Last Movie, where it was just garbage being put up. So it's the idea of the pendulum swinging from a studio system where they controlled everything with an iron hand and changed the films around and wouldn't let genius be shown, to the point where they were just desperately giving the keys to the maniacs, basically, and letting them drive around and do whatever they wanted. With the result that the 70s had some great films, but also had a lot of garbage going up there as well.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis Hopper appears, you know, in the film and the documentary in parts and things. And, you know, coming out of Easy Rider, that really was a big change for the whole Hollywood system. For one thing, it was shot so cheap and it made so much money that they were like, oh man, if we can do this, put together a cheap film and make a lot of money with it, like a younger audience and stuff, this is great. And of course, Wells wasn't really interested in doing that kind of film. Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show, What's Up Doc, Paper Moon, he had 3 in a row that were big. He fell off after that. Paul Mazursky is the other actor, director who's in the documentary and the film. And he did An Unmarried Woman, Bob Carrollton Alice, Bloom in Love. You know, all films that made money and were considered New Hollywood. But the one that he's really making fun of course,
Hold on,
is...
Ken.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop you right there for a second. For some reason, your camera is not on.
I'm not sure. I just turned it on and off, and it doesn't seem to want to be here.
Okay.
I'm on an iPad, and I don't know. Maybe it didn't like being on the iPad. Let's see.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just.
Let me go back. Let's try to on off again. No, it's not.
Hmm.
No, it's not liking the camera.
Okay.
I will play, but
That's fine.
I can see myself, but
There's nothing in front of your camera?
no, it's not in front of my camera.
Okay.
It's sitting right here.
You can see a picture of you, so you can go ahead and.
Well, that's stop video. If I go to start video, it goes black.
Yeah.
I mean, the camera's the camera.
Keep the video or keep the picture up. Oh, wait, there's something. That works.
Well, now I just picked my iPad up. Let me shut off here. See what happens if I go
You
dark.
can see your notes now.
Well, this is not good. Okay, I'm going to switch off and I'm going to change the camera setting.
There we go.
You know what it is? It's not
Is it flipped?
reversing. Yeah, it's not flipping itself to the other way, even if I go to the camera and tell it to flip.
That's fine. Just keep it off and we can at least see your picture.
All right. Well, when somebody's talking, I'll play with it. I'll keep it off so you don't see things flipping, and I'll try. Okay. So where were we? Dennis Hopper, New Hollywood. Paper Moon, Dennis Hopper. Well, so the second question I was kind of asking there was, based on the interviews with Wells and whatever else you know about his films, what do you think he found so worthy of satire in the New Hollywood films? Why didn't he like it? And I'll tell you a sort of anti-answer to that. You would think he might have actually liked the New Hollywood, with the idea that, you know, the director is the star, the director is the writer, you're an auteur, as the French, you know, would say about their new wave directors, and that things were shot like low budget and very different and creative. That seemed to be like something appealing, kind of an outlaw approach to it, because he was considered an outlaw in the early days of Hollywood. So what was it that he was so against? Anybody?
I think nudity.
Definitely that.
It's definitely the other side of midnight is pretty much the film within the film. It gets to the point, it's so meta, it's like film within a film within a film, especially when you actually get the documentary on it as well. But he was just showing how everything was nudity. He made great films without any nudity, and this is showing that the entire film was just almost wall-to-wall nudity, and it was his desperate attempt to try to relate to the younger generation via that.
Do you think he was doing the nudity because he hoped it would sell the film, or he was making fun of the fact that they would use that in their New Hollywood films for no real reason?
Making fun of it. I think he was using it as a mockumentary.
Yeah, I think he was mocking it because, like, one of the things I said is that Bogdanovich said that he was actually kind of a prude when it came to nudity and sex and things, and he got an R rating for Other Side of the Wind, which, you know, had never happened to him before. And, you know, the girlfriend does all the nudity in the film. You know, I guess the guy does some in there too, everything. But he's making fun of films that do that. Like, there was really no reason for it. And that's his kind of his satire for it. I don't know what he thought if people would watch The Other Side of the Wind and say, oh, it's like Antonioni and, you know, all the New Hollywood people. I'm not sure that's what it was. He was like making fun of what was then popular, which almost makes no sense. I could see why studios didn't want to support it.
Marion has a quick question.
Okay.
Yeah, it was an observation, but it wasn't related. It was from before this. What I was thinking about was not American New Wave, but with La Dolce Vita. It was like the total chaos around the director, but it works in La Dolce Vita, and it was just a mess in The Other Side of the Wind. I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, some of Fellini's films are sort of chaotic and people running in and out and scenes that don't seem to make much sense at one point. But, you know, they were all getting great reviews, those directors. So I think that was part of it. He was imitating it. I mean, as long as we're talking about the comparisons, the film that he really was modeling it on was Zabriskie Point by Antonioni, whose big hit was kind of Blow Up, was his film. But he got a package deal to do 3 films in America with MGM, which is something Wells would have loved. So he came over to America to make those films. And Zabriskie Point was a bomb. I mean, it did not do well, did not get good reviews. It did not do well at the box office. And as I said, it's kind of gotten a little bit of a revival since then, that people think, you know, it had some innovative things going on. But it's one of those films where people walk through scenes and don't talk. And, you know, there's a lot of symbolism, supposedly. And they actually shot the film, Other Side of the Wind, the party scene, that house is the house next to the one in Zabriskie Point. So they used the same desert settings and things like that. He was, you know, absolutely doing a parody of what Antonioni had done in Zabriskie Point. I think what really bothered him about New Hollywood films was that there was no story. I mean, he really wanted a story. And that he thought these films, like Easy Rider, for example, what's the story? 2 guys go on their motorcycles on the road, meet some people along the way, and get killed at the end. There is no story. And it was shot where, you know, they shot a scene and then they thought of another scene to do and they shot that. and he thought that was sloppy filmmaking. And he wanted a story that had an actual structure. Now you could say, well, then why didn't he make a film that had an actual structure? Well, because that's what he was mocking. He was mocking that kind of film, so he had to make that kind of film, which, you know, you could say that was his mistake on that point. Another thing about interesting, I mean, the making of the film, that it comes up in there, I didn't ask about it, but the whole funding of the film with the Shah of Iran's brother-in-law and the film being taken over by the Ayatollah, and then it's put in a vault in France and everything. It's just a crazy story. That's why I actually think the making of the film, the documentary, the making of the film is more interesting than the film itself because of the way that it happened. Now, I think he's also making fun of the funding, which was an issue for him for a good part of his career. He just could not get funding for a film in distribution. That sort of ended at a certain point for him. You know, looking at the films that Wells made, everybody knows Citizen Kane. I mean, often considered to be maybe the greatest American film ever made. But that was the only film he ever made where he had total control. Studio let him do whatever he wanted to do. And he said it was like being in a toy store. And he wanted to do things that they said, you can't do that. Nobody does that. Nobody shoots from below the floor. Nobody puts ceilings in the shots. You don't build sets with ceilings. You don't shoot at that low angle, you know, all these things. And he just did it. But his second film, The Magnificent Ambersons, which is a really interesting film, but it got taken away from him and they totally recut it while he was away in South America, and they changed the ending on him. And they actually got rid of the negative, so we could never put it back together the way he wanted it to be. And he really never had full control over the other films. I mean, he made some commercial films. I don't know if you've ever seen The Stranger. That's an interesting film. That's a pretty commercial film. The Lady from Shanghai. He did a couple of Shakespeare's, a Macbeth and an Othello. But then in the 1950s, things really kind of fell apart for him. And most of the films he did then were either taken away from him or recut or something like that. There was Mr. Arcaden, The Touch of Evil, The Trial, Chimes at Midnight, The Immortal Story. And the last film that he really did, which is actually an interesting documentary, is F for Fake. And that was in 1973. And the two films he was working on that didn't get finished in his lifetime were The Other Side of the Wind, and he also had a Don Quixote film, which was released after his death, which is dreadful. And they said, you know, they just grabbed all the pieces that they had and put it together into something, but it's nothing like what he would have done. So, you know, his career went in a very strange direction there and was taken out of his hands.
Raymond has a quick question.
Okay.
Yes, hi. I wonder if anybody has the opinion that perhaps Orson was making like an intentionally bad, like a parody, like a spoof, like a piece of the ultimate crap in the genre of the new wave. You know, like, does anybody think that Orson was, you know, like the ultimate non-script, like zero script, and the ultimate lack of story, and, you know, like just the worst piece ever in order to say, you see, you know, that whole, you know, new wave is like crap. Thank you.
Well, you know, I think in different forms of art, you have that kind of thing. I mean, at some point in painting, there are people who take a white canvas and put a black circle on it and say, you know, this is art. This is art. And you'd say, like, well, is it art? Well, I'm making fun of people who think that this is art. But there are also people selling paintings that look like a black circle on a white canvas. So it's possible that he made a bad film as a comment on the fact that people were making bad films. But then if you make a bad film, who's going to distribute your bad film? I mean, who's going to get the joke? So I don't know that he could have been thinking that fully. But you also, you know, as somebody said, there's a film within a film. There's The Other Side of the Wind, the color film, and then there's all that documentary footage shot around it. And it's really, that's his story. His story is about a director whose career has faded and who wants to make one more film, and he figures the only way to do it is to make a film like the new Hollywood films that everybody seems to like now. And that's what Orson Welles did. He made a film that includes the kind of film that everybody seems to like now. Still didn't get distribution for it, but that was his idea. The other thing that they do in the documentary, they pretty much show you that it's done. He asked all kinds of people for no pay to act in the film, and he also had like students and things that were shooting on Super 8 cameras, 16mm cameras, early video stuff and everything, which they wanted to use all that footage and make it look like, we cobbled together all this like found footage, which was not a concept that was known in the 70s, but that has become a kind of genre for films, found footage films, where, you find all this film that had been shot by somebody and you put it together in some form. So that was kind of a little bit ahead of the time. There are also some people he's definitely making fun of in the film. There's a character, Charles Higham. He's a parody of this journalist, Charles Higham, who wrote 2 really unflattering books about Orson Welles. And in one of the books, he complains about Welles making fun of him. Also, the Juliet character, who's played by Strasberg, is supposed to be based on Pauline Kael, who gave some negative reviews to Orson. So he's digging at not only Hollywood, but at the critics, what they're looking for, what they're praising. Like Pauline Kael and some of these other people were highly praising some of the films that came out, like The Wild Bunch, Bonnie and Clyde, and things like that. And he just didn't see it. He didn't see where that was coming from. Any other comments there? The other thing that I always want to ask about the director and the person who puts together the film, Morgan Neville is the guy who put together this film. And with documentaries, people always say, like, I don't understand why he's a director. Isn't he more like an editor? Does he just like put together a bunch of other people's stuff? How is that directing? Well, it's the way you put it together. Now, he did 20 Feet from Stardom, which is a really good music documentary about the backup singers for a lot of the big R&B bands. And he did the Mr. Rogers film, Won't You Be My Neighbor, which I think is a great documentary. So he's a good documentary filmmaker. I mean, he got these 100 hours of film and had to put together not The Other Side of the Wind. That's another job. He had to put together a documentary about the making of The Other Side of the Wind. So he had access to, like I said, a lot of footage that had never been seen before. He added some new stuff, but not a lot of new stuff. And as with the other 2 documentaries that we watched, you had to put it together in some coherent way, all these disparate pieces that you have. So what's your take on how well Neville tied together the quite confusing story of the making The Other Side of Wind? What worked, what didn't work in that approach? Is there anything that hit you?
Joyce had something really quick.
Okay.
I don't know if it's related to that question or not, Joyce.
No, I don't want to change the topic. It's just related to something else, so I'll save it.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll come back to that.
All right, so we're talking about putting it together. I see a hand there. Yep.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I was amused by the fact that the director of the documentary followed in the footsteps of the style that Orson used for both his film and the film within the film. He also, in some of the shots, transition shot, where he used the actor, I can't remember, the British actor with that incredible voice. He also used some mirrors, with that. He used image into image, a TV within a TV scene, frame within frame. And the fast cutting that he did and the confusion, it just basically, he was celebrating probably that spirit of Orson Welles' style for that film. And I think it was entertaining. Otherwise, it would have been crazy to really follow through that thing.
So you think it was a good thing that he used that style?
Yes, very much
Thought
so.
You thought it worked for the film?
For me, it did. For me, it did because, you know, I mean, let's put it this way. You can't take either of these films very seriously. Because if you think about it, I'm not sure that a man of Orson Welles' reputation was really happy not working with some established funds over 7 years, I believe, or so, that the shooting of that film took. He had no money. He had to stop in between. So I'm not sure that he was taking the whole thing to the point where he thought that he was making a masterpiece or anything like that. I think to me, it sounds to me like he was punishing some people for maybe the way he was treated by what he was producing. And I think the filmmaker in that same sense of style, of an amusing style, to be honest with you, the right shot, I mean, edit it in that way. With just a lot of confusion, very similar to the film.
I don't know if anybody else got this sense, but I felt in the documentary, the second half of it kind of calmed down a little bit. It wasn't quite as frenetic in the second half. Like when they were showing him talking in France and things like that, it almost felt more like a conventional documentary as it approached the end of his life and the end of, you know, the film. There's one interesting scene where he's in France, he's being interviewed like in a courtyard, and he says, well, maybe the film, maybe The Other Side of the Wind should be like a documentary. Maybe it should be a film about making a film. Maybe it shouldn't be a film. Maybe that is the film. So it's like he was still kind of working out what the film was going to be. And I have a feeling that Morgan Neville kind of picked up on that and said, yeah, that's really what it could be. It's the making of the film. Because even The Other Side of the Wind is about how the film is made. Like when you're in the screening room and the guy who's obviously a producer is watching what they've got, and he's saying like, but there's a script, right? He goes, what is this scene about? What's he supposed to be doing there? I don't understand what he's doing. And it's like, I know, nobody understands what he's doing, but it'll all come together. When we edit it, the whole thing will come together. And it's like, maybe it doesn't come together. Maybe that's just the way these new Hollywood films are made. They just throw all this stuff at you, and you're supposed to look at it and say, oh, I understand. The symbolism here is that our lives are empty. That's why the room is empty. I see what they're doing here. And I think that's what he was making fun of, but not everyone got the joke. And of course, the new Hollywood, like I said, it's been a long time since the new Hollywood. So it's not fresh in your mind when you're watching it. Films like Zabriskie Point and Blow Up and those kind of films are not fresh in your mind. So you're judging it on the basis of films today, which is really not a fair way to judge it.
But then again, don't we have to look at the film as a work by itself? I mean, about the documentary. Regardless, you're a historian, right? You can compare all that thing. But when we're watching a film, whether it's a full film or a documentary or anything like that, we have to judge it on its own merit, as
Right.
if nothing else exists, for us anyway. Now,
Right.
for you, it has other connection. You might see the jokes, you might see all the stuff, but ultimately, the film should be judged strictly, in my opinion, on whether we like it or not and the meaning of it.
Well, and that's why I say a little bit like the Jim and Andy and Man on the Moon. Man on the Moon is a film, and Jim and Andy is a separate film. And you can't say, well, I like one, but I don't like the other. I mean, you can like one and not like the other. I like the documentary less than I like the actual Man on the Moon. In this case, I like the documentary better than I like The Other Side of the Wind. I mean, they are, like you said, two separate things, and they shouldn't be judged together. Unfortunately, the documentary uses a lot of Other Side of the Wind footage. So in a way, you're watching The Other Side of the Wind, but in a much more disjointed way than if you actually watched the film The Other Side of the Wind. It is very meta, as somebody said. It's like layer upon layer upon layer in a way, which I know can be confusing to people. especially if you're not an Orson Welles fan to begin with.
I'm a very big Orson Welles fan, and even though I've only seen a couple of his films, but I watched the documentary last night, and then I watched the actual film today, and I still haven't processed The Other Side of the Wind, because it was like a hurricane that just came at me. It's so dense that I haven't quite wrapped my brain around it yet, but I found it very interesting. I really enjoyed, I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but I appreciated the documentary because I learned a lot about Orson Welles that I did not know. And I think the interesting thing is when I first started watching it, knowing nothing about his fascination with Hemingway, as soon as I kind of got a sense of him, Hemingway just came to my mind. I was like, he should have played Hemingway. I mean, it was all of that hyper macho, self-loathing, just a fascinating character. And I could follow the documentary because it had some kind of linear, progression. The actual movie, I got to tell you, in fact, I was telling my husband, he was watching me watch it. I went from laughing hysterically at some of the scenes, that were just absurd, to just wanting to weep, because for me, I just saw such deep anger and resentment, and it was like a hate letter to Hollywood instead of a love letter.
Yeah.
And I saw all kinds of mockery of the films that were coming out at the time, but I also saw, I saw all these different layers of Wells, played by Houston, that were kind of heartbreaking. He was a very, troubled, brilliant man, and I took a lot of the film as spoof, and like his mistress in real life, the actress. I walked away thinking he never really humanized her. He never really gave her any depth. She was just this sexual object that was kind of wafting around, which was odd and funny sometimes in a weird way. So I have to see the movie again, because I don't think I've absorbed it. I thought I was watching Eraserhead at one point. And it was just like wacky, but very rich, I found.
So the other side of the, go ahead. Who's some?
No, I was going to say it's possible, and I'm sure Wells is not the only director or person involved in movie making that his talent was not worth the trouble of having him involved in a movie from the production end of a film. I've seen, he was a great actor also, but it's possible that it was just too much. And yes, of course you're going to have anger in his films, because he felt he was betrayed, but maybe he was just too much. I mean, are there other directors that you can reference, or anybody could reference, that might fall into the same category of he's good but not worth the effort?
Elaine May, briefly.
Yeah, she was great. That was a good movie of hers.
Well, Wells, if I said, if you were a producer in 1970, would you have invested $5 million in an Orson Welles film? I wouldn't. As much as I love Orson Welles, I wouldn't, because at that point, I didn't feel he could pull it off. He wouldn't finish the film. It would probably go on and on. It would be uncuttable, and that sort of thing. So, I mean, there's a lot of bitterness about Hollywood and filmmaking in there. I mean, Wells, you got to remember, Wells' first 10 years, pretty much everybody's saying he's a genius. He's a genius. He had just come off War of the
Right.
Worlds and Broadway and everything, and everybody was like, this guy's a genius. I mean, he's a genius. He'd been told since he was a kid that he was a
Right.
genius. So to go from that to like, this is a guy, you know, we're not giving this guy any money. This guy can't put anything together anymore, you know? That bitterness definitely shows up. Like I said, it's anti-New Hollywood, but it's also anti these new directors. It's anti the way producers try to control the budgets on films. It's anti-film critics. It's anti a lot of stuff.
But he takes no responsibility himself. It's like Trump. It's everybody else's fault. It was not his fault. Sorry to bring politics into this, everyone.
Well, you know, if
I've got to disagree with that, though. I've got to disagree with that because he's eviscerating everyone, but clearly the John Huston character is himself, and he's eviscerating himself as well. He's not presenting the John Huston character in a positive fashion. The character of Jack is a bully, and he's a drunkard, and he's an individual who treats people like shit. So he's eviscerating everyone, the critics and the producers and the hangers-on and everyone else. But he's also attacking himself as well because he's not presenting a positive, decent man in the middle of this who's beset by all these terrible people.
I stand corrected by your astute observation.
Well, but here's a counter, is that Wells maintained right to the end that it's not an autobiographical film. He is not the John Huston director. This is not the person. Somebody mentioned Hemingway. Bogdanovich said it's no accident that the day that the film is supposed to take place, The Other Side of the Wind, the day of the party, and the day that Jake dies is the day that Hemingway committed suicide. He said that's not an accident. You know, Hemingway is kind of the model for the John Huston director, the tough guy. I mean, Orson Welles never tried to come off as the tough guy, the man's man, or anything like that. That was not his style or anything. So this director is very different than him, other than the fact that he was a great director whose career fell apart and is trying to make one last film. That's
the suicides of their fathers.
I didn't catch that. What?
Suicides of their fathers, because Orson Welles' father committed suicide, as did the character in this, and they were both scarred by that. So I think that's the typical.
As did Hemingway's father.
Yeah. Ooh, that's creepy.
All of them. Three of a kind.
Yeah. So I mean, that's definitely part of it. Another thing, I'm going to jump to the question because I brought it up here that Wells claimed the film was not autobiographical. It's not supposed to be him. But nevertheless, I mean, there is definitely some stuff. But like I said, Jake's death, July 2nd, meant to be an allusion to Hemingway's suicide. And, you know, Jake was meant to be some other director from the studio days. He really was thinking of, he said, John Ford. And actually, John Huston himself was kind of a guy. I mean, I don't know if John Huston picked up on the fact that he was making fun of John Huston. They were friends, so he wasn't like terribly mocking him, but he was saying like, John, you're going to play yourself. You play yourself. You know, the young girl who's the actress, you're going to make a move on her, you know, like you've done, you know, in real life, and you smoke your cigars and you drink hard and you drive the fast car and everything like that. You just be John Huston. That's all. Just be John Huston. Okay.
I have a question. Who financed the making of the documentary? Was that Netflix?
Netflix, yes. They ponied up $12 million to make the
'cause
documentary.
I can't imagine that there would be a huge audience for this.
Well, see, Netflix is in that unique situation of being able to say, we don't really care. We're going to run it on the channel. People will watch it. We're not even going to tell you how many people watched it. We don't care if it ever gets into a theater. It's irrelevant to us. We can just do that. And to them, 12 million is what they would typically spend to have an independent film made. So if you can put it together for 12 million, I always imagine, because of the distribution thing, what if Wells had been given in 1970 $12 million to put together a film, you know, and it could have been The Other Side of the Wind or anything. He had other films he wanted to do, like Don Quixote and stuff like that. What would he have done? I suspect, as I said before, that he might not have been able to pull it off at that point in his life. He might have ended up with a $12 million film that wasn't a film, was unreleasable. And you got to remember, the new Hollywood died because of some big disaster films that were made, like Michael Cimino, who had The Deer Hunter, then had Heaven's Gate, which went like, $60 million over budget and things. And it was a terrible bomb and everything. And they started to say, you can't be giving these guys this money to make these films. They're burning it up, and nobody wants to see these movies. So the new Hollywood kind of died. And we went back to a more traditional kind of filmmaking.
Steve has a question.
Good.
Steve, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have a question. In the other side of the wind, the man with the white hair, like with a khaki jacket, who was he? Who was filmed a lot? Who was that?
I'm not sure which character you're referring to. In the actual Other Side of the Wind film, not the documentary. In the footage from The Other Side of the Wind.
In the footage from The Other Side of the Wind, he had white hair. He wore like a khaki jacket. His eyes were real close. He was filmed a lot. That wasn't John Huston, right?
No. Is it the guy who was seemed to be sort of a producer? Was eating a lot of candy?
No, not him. No, not him. Who was the guy that was killed in the car crash?
Oh, that's John Huston.
That's John Huston?
Yeah, John Huston is Jake, and Jake dies in a car crash.
Who's Jake?
John Huston's character is called Jake, the director. He's the director of The Other Side of the Wind. And we're watching him on the last day of his life as he's being followed by reporters and critics and fans.
So that's John Huston. I thought they called him another name. That character. And I guess I'm mistaken. Okay.
Well, they might have called him by his last name a couple of times too.
What's his last name?
In the film, he's Hannaford.
Hannaford.
Jake Hannaford.
Oh.
So they
Okay.
might have said, Hannaford's films.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Now I get it. Thanks.
Okay.
Ken,
right. Yes.
So I was going to say one thing that was not so relevant, and the other thing I was just saying while I was listening to this was, he had a great deal. Orson Welles had a great deal of command over these people's lives. Like, I mean, was he not getting something out of that behavior? Like, I think it was either Tom or Bashir that said before about that. Used the word bad, and I forget in what context it was used, but like this guy Gary, who was the cameraman, I mean, he wouldn't even let him eat. I mean, he went into the hospital with like a nervous breakdown or something during the shooting of the documentary, which is what we're really talking about. But so I mean, it felt like he had so much power to control these people and make them do what they wanted to do, and maybe he didn't even know what he wanted to do, but he was making them obey, so to speak. That was the impression that part of the impression that I got.
Well, the way that the students and the young people who were shooting the documentary around Jake in the film, he had his followers, Wells, and that's what he loved about being in Europe. And it's like the old joke that, Jerry Lewis was considered a genius in France. Well, he really was. They loved his stuff and everything. And they loved Wells. They loved the old films. They loved everything he did. So they would fawn upon him and, call him a genius and ask him questions about the history of film and everything. And he loved that attention, and he wasn't getting it in the US, and maybe he wanted it when he came back. He thought he would still have that kind of attention, which he didn't really have that back in the US when he returned. He was considered kind of a has-been, which I'm sure hurt a lot for him. And actually, a lot of people worked for free on the film. It wasn't like you were getting paid and like 4 years later, we're going to shoot some more footage and you're getting paid again. And it was sort of like Woody Allen had this for a time where, people would do a Woody Allen film just because they wanted to get into a Woody Allen film. So they'd work for, scale. It didn't matter. I just want to be in a Woody Allen film. Like they shot at that house in the desert. And then a couple of years later, they needed to shoot again and he couldn't get to the desert. again, they couldn't get back there. So he shot at Peter Bogdanovich's house, and they just kind of rigged it so that it looked like it. I mean, if you're really paying attention, you'll see that some of the shots don't even match in there. But he figured nobody's going to really notice. Nobody pays that kind of close attention to a film. And so he snuck onto back lots, you know, the other side of the wind where the man and the woman are walking through those, what look like sets or deserted buildings or whatever. Those are sets from like the back lots at MGM and Paramount and stuff that they literally snuck onto because he had nowhere to shoot. So they would sneak on there and hopefully not get caught and shoot some footage and then sneak off and everything. Because he was really working on a nothing budget. So, you know, the actors who acted, most of them did not get paid for what they did. So, I mean, John Huston included. He just did it as a favor to Orson.
So
I see a question here, though.
Ken, I know we're approaching the end of the time. And the other quick question I wanted to ask to you, a question that's always come up in my mind is, because I'm not a student of this, why do they always say that Citizen Kane was one of the greatest movies that ever was? Like, what are the attributes that the professionals or the world or whoever it is gives? I've heard it so many times. Why do they say that?
A lot of it is technological kinds of things that he did with the camera, some of the camera moves and the editing and things like that. For example, he worked with his cinematographer, Greg Tolan. He wanted it, he said, I want to do this shot and I want to see the person sitting like 2 feet away from the camera is in focus, but also the person that's 35 feet away. He said, you can't do that. He said, it's not possible. You know, you'd need a camera that could, you know, have a special lens on it, and you need so much light. And he goes, but that's what I want to do. So he said, well, we'll try. And he did it. And like I said, he built sets that had ceilings because he wanted the camera down on the floor. And they said, we don't put ceilings on the sets. And he goes, yeah, but I don't want to shoot into the lights. I want to be able to point up. So they built those sets. So he did a lot of things with the editing and the way he put it together. There was one of the opening shots is a camera, you know, like it's on a boom kind of thing, and it comes across and floats through a window and stuff, things that nobody had done. But he just said, I want to do this. And they said, nobody does that. You can't do that. And he said, there's got to be a way to do it. So like they would dig holes in the floor of the set and put the camera down at foot level, you know, and all kinds of crazy things. It's a really good story. It's a very interesting story. And it would have been a big hit in its time, other than the fact that he was making fun of the most powerful person in the journalism world at that time.
Also, you want to, Ken?
There's actually a documentary coming out soon. If you're a Citizen Kane person, David Fincher's doing a documentary called Mank. It's about Herman Mankiewicz, who was the co-author of Citizen Kane, and a lot of controversy about how much of it he wrote and how much of it Orson wrote and that sort of thing. And it's supposed to be a really interesting story about how Citizen Kane was put together and everything. Somebody else had a question, though. I heard a voice.
Ken, there's one character that they interview in the documentary. He says he's John Huston's son. Now, I've seen this guy in other movies. What's his claim to fame? Or is he a director? You know the gentleman I'm talking about?
Danny Huston?
Danny
He
Huston.
was John Huston's son, gray-haired kind of guy, relatively young.
Danny.
Yeah, Danny Huston, I think.
He's a director and actor.
And actor. Yeah, I've seen him in some things, but is there any specific movies that he's made that he's famous for or well known for?
I'm just quick looking at something here to see. Danny, I mean, his face is very recognizable, you know, even now. Let's see. His latest work is Angel Has Fallen. That's not a big one. Game Night, Wonder Woman.
Okay.
Justice League seems to do a lot of those kind of films. Hitchcock, he was in Hitchcock.
Okay. I'll look him
The
up.
Aviator. Yeah, you know, he's done a lot of films. Somebody commented, maybe it was Raymond, somebody said in the chat, I wish they had put little titles over some of the names like they often do in a documentary, like who's talking. I mean, like, I don't know if you're not a movie person, you'd know that Paul Mazursky was in the film, or that Dennis Hopper is in the movie. You wouldn't put it in The Other Side of the Wind, but in the documentary version, when you have those people
Could have been used.
talking, those are real directors. 3 real directors are talking about the new Hollywood and kind of saying the kind of stuff that Orson Welles would have said that's BS kind of thing. I think Dennis Hopper was probably high when he was talking there. He was sort of incoherent. But I think he liked that footage probably, Welles, because he probably said, yeah, it's just like the films he made, incoherent. They don't make any sense. That's my point. They don't make any sense.
I have to say, one of the things that I found hilarious, and maybe it's just my warped sense of humor, but as soon as there would be this tremendous tension in the film, whether it was a sexual tension or an argument at the party, it seemed like out of the blue, the screen would say missing scene.
Yes.
and I just thought, this is not only funny because we know it's never going to be filled in, obviously, but also because it's kind of like what the movie's about. It's like the creative process is what he loved, and
Yep.
the finished product ain't necessarily going to happen, and it's not going to measure up to the pictures in his head, And it was just, I just thought it was hilarious.
Well, as I asked on one of the questions, what sequences from the documentary of Welles being interviewed encouraged the autobiographical interpretation of Other Side of the Wind? Well, one of them is definitely unintentional, but Other Side of the Wind is about a director who's trying to make his last film and who dies, and the film is not finished, which is what happens to Welles in his real life. Not
Right.
intentionally, but he dies with his last film being unfinished. Not a suicide or anything like that, or a car accident, but I mean, it is kind of, in a way, it is definitely Orson Welles' story. As much as Orson Welles says, this is not about me, it's about the new Hollywood and the old directors. The reason he chose an old director was because the old director doesn't fit in the new Hollywood anymore. Things have changed and they don't fit in, and I don't fit in anymore. I can't make these films.
Can I just put in a plug for Easy Rider? I remember seeing that at the Caldwell Theater on Bloomfield Avenue, and walking out after that last scene where they got shot, sobbing, almost breathless, sitting in the car with my husband and just sobbing. I could barely speak. And to me, that movie signified the 60s. It signified the political atmosphere. The dichotomy between the Easy Riders or anybody who wasn't of the macho Southern Western gun-toting people. They came down, they were outsiders. They were totally foreign to those people. And the shock of seeing him shot was, I will never, ever forget that moment. So I'm not so sure it was incoherent. It wasn't incoherent to me, that movie. I know exactly what was going on there, except for the ending.
I feel the same way about that film. I don't think that film's incoherent. The incoherent is Dennis Hopper's like the last movie and the things that he made afterwards. But I felt the same way when I saw the film. I mean, I had friends that had gotten harassed because of their long hair and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I felt like, oh my God, I mean, this is what we're living through. I mean, the one character looks like David Crosby from Crosby, Stills and Nash and the Birds and everything like that. And he wore the fringe jacket the same way. And I mean, I identified with all that, but I watched Easy Rider about a year ago again, and it really seems dated. I mean, it seems, some of the scenes just seem kind of corny at this point, but in its time, it was a really important film for its time. It definitely changed Hollywood, like I said, because of the fact that it was a low budget film that made a lot of money, and they wanted to capitalize on that, and they were willing to take chances on young directors, like Francis Ford Coppola, and even George Lucas, and those people kind of fall into that category where they let them take basically a student film and turn it into something. So I'm not anti that film, but Dennis Hopper didn't create a lot of great movies after that period. So.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Was Orson Welles, was he admired by the French New Wave, les cahiers du cinéma, authors, and so on?
Was he influenced? Is that your question?
Were they, you know how some of these film directors in France of that time, they were admirers of some of the old-time American filmmakers. Was he one of them? They liked him.
They loved him. I mean, they really considered him an auteur, and that, a Welles film was totally a Welles film, that he controlled everything about it. But the films that they loved were, generally his older films, Kane and Ambersons and The Stranger and Lady from Shanghai and that sort of thing. But they were definitely influenced by him. That's why he was like revered over there, and he loved being over there. And the film students always wanted him to talk about, the movies. He also would badmouth what was going on in movies at that time, which they loved because they wanted to rebel against what was going on in movies. So, if you're looking at, French New Wave films and things like that, it's the same kind of thing. Like, even like early, like Francois Truffaut or something like that, early films were, sort of renegade films shot on low budgets and, edited in sort of strange ways and things like that with odd angles and all that kind of stuff. The things that he did, they wanted to do. But even that kind of fell out of favor too. And like I said, like Antonioni is brought over to the US to make 3 American films. And the films he makes, he sort of makes them the way he would have made them if he was back in Italy, but they don't do well because they're so odd. I mean, Blow Up was the only one I think that actually made any money. And even that is a kind of strange film. Somebody says, I love The Third Man. I love The Third Man too. A lot of people think that Welles directed some of the films he acted in when he didn't. He didn't direct The Third Man, although they say he had some influence over the director. One of his most commercial films was The Stranger. I don't know if anybody's ever seen The Stranger.
I've seen it.
It's about a Nazi hunter in Connecticut with Edward G. Robinson is a Nazi hunter, and he's tracking down a guy who is Welles, who is now hiding in the US and pretending to be an American. It's really a real commercial Hollywood film, and it actually did well for him. And he was the director, he was the co-screenwriter, he acted in it. John Huston was the co-screenwriter, but he didn't get credit for it. So, I mean, he did a couple of commercial films and, did all right. But then, as it often happens, you have a big film that makes a lot of money, and then they're willing to give you some money to do your personal film. And his personal films, like Macbeth and Othello, which I think are really good, just didn't do anything. So it was hard to get funding for the next one. Touch of Evil is a really interesting film, but is also a very strange film. He did the Trial, which is based on the Franz Kafka novel. That's a bizarre film, but it's a really interesting film. So if you get a chance to see some of the other Orson Welles films, they're not like The Other Side of the Wind at all. I would check them out. I think we're beyond our time.
We
here,
are.
but...
Donna had a question before we go. She's had her hand up for a little while.
Okay. Go, Donna.
You have to unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there was like a through line that he was always trying to make the money to make the films, though. He, how he had to go back to work. And then even when he was at that award ceremony, he presented clips from his film. So he really never gave up the passion to be a filmmaker. And I find it so hard to believe he took off for years, to just make a living, to make money, to support his passion of filmmaking when he couldn't get funded.
Well, people made fun of him in his later life because he was doing like the Paul Masson wine commercials or, frozen peas from, Bird's Eye or something like that. And people say, boy, has he fallen down. But what they didn't realize is he would do a commercial, he'd get $150,000 and he'd spend $150,000 to try to keep working on the film. So in a way, it's like, I don't know if it's true today, but a lot of American actors go over to like Japan and do commercials for, beer and stuff like that, because it's an easy, $500,000 kind of thing. And then you can use that to produce your own film or something like that. So it's not unusual what he did. So, I don't think he was a sellout at all. I just think nobody would give him money for a film. So he did whatever he could do to make money to make a film. And he continued to act in some really strange films over the years.
It's interesting how Wells' personal issues, his parental issues, were there in the beginning and they were there at the end, because Citizen Kane, the main thing that we find is driving that character is the loss of his parents. We see
Right.
that at the end with Rosebud, with the destruction of the sleigh. That it all goes back to his parents, and that was his first film. And then his very last film, it's about the suicide of the father. That's the thing that can't be mentioned in front of Jake. So he was dealing with that issue in film number 1, and he was dealing with that issue in his very last film.
Yeah. Well, like I said, there's clearly autobiographical elements, no matter how much Wells said it was not autobiographical. It's not purely autobiographical. I mean, Jake is more like John Huston than he is like Orson Welles. But, obviously Wells's life comes into the film in a number of ways. The more you know about Wells, the more you see in the film that's autobiographical. So, well, I think we're at the end of our third and final film for the month. Like we said, hopefully if people enjoyed it, we can do it again at a future date.